Hello, yes, a very warm welcome to this event, Europe's dependence on the US defense industrial base, source of transatlantic strengths or geopolitical vulnerability. My name is Guntram Wolf and I'm a senior fellow here at Bruegel as well as a professor of economics at the Université Libre de Bruxelles, and it's a great pleasure to host this event today. So what we want to do is we want to talk about this issue first from a more European perspective, and I will give a short presentation based on two recent papers that we published on US foreign military sales and their impact on the European technological base and the dependence on the US and what consequences Europe should draw. After my very short presentation, there will be an equally short presentation by Ethan Kapstein. He teaches at Princeton University and is a former naval officer of the US Navy and therefore also sort of a long-standing expert on this issue. He will take a more transatlantic position on the matter. And then we had, as a third speaker, Anne Foch, who is a deputy head of cabinet of Commissioner Kubilius. Unfortunately, she had to drop out this morning, literally due to another commitment. And we are very happy that Georgi Yanakiev has agreed to step in. Georgi is also an expert on the matter. He is from DG Defis and is a team leader on defense markets at the European Commission's DG Defis. So I think that's going to be a great debate. We are looking forward, of course, also to your questions. And let me say that you can also, if you are following us online or also here in the room, you can also ask questions through Slido with the hashtag defense, and I'll see it here on the pad. Okay, so I guess the topic doesn't need a lot of introduction. Of course, let me start directly with the papers. So what we want to do is, let me see whether this works. Yeah. So what we want to talk about is really European rearmament and pretty big trade-offs that European policymakers are faced with. I think one big trade-off is certainly the speed of rearmament versus lock-in effects and autonomy losses. And I think the broader background doesn't need a lot of introduction, but it's clear that Europe has a need for rearmament. And because of the worsening security situation, as we have increased our defense spending, a significant and actually increasing part of that defense spending has gone to US military equipment. At the same time, it's fair to say the transatlantic relationship has seen better times than the current ones. I think we all agree with that. Yeah, okay, so it's debatable. Let's see. But what I think makes this special is that for this particular topic is that the US president has direct powers over military sales of the United States to any country in the world. And that's through the instrument of the US foreign military sales, which is the core of the paper that we produced with Juan Mejino Lopez, whom I'm seeing there in the back. So US foreign military sales is a specific instrument for the United States government to sell weapons. It consists of essentially an agreement between the US government and a foreign government. And the US government, before it signs and before the president signs that deal, negotiates with the domestic defense industry and notifies US Congress to get approval or not approval from US Congress to actually do the sale. And these notifications is what is at the core of our paper. We basically analyze these notifications in big detail. And that means we have built a complete database of almost 1,200 notifications from 2008 to 25, which are really, really detailed documents, several pages, PDFs with all the details on the weapons, on the weapon systems, on the associated ammunition, on the prices, on the quantities. And thanks to modern large language models, we could basically extract that information into a database, and that database is published on the Bruegel website also for wider use. And what we want to do is and what we have done is we have analyzed the patterns of exports to the world, but also to Europe more specifically. And we want to understand to what extent this creates also vulnerability, not just strengths, but also vulnerabilities. In any case, perhaps the last point on the motivation, it is clear that any dependency also in the weapons delivery space, even if it's very unlikely to be used, does change the relationship, the political relationship, the economic relationship in many, many other areas by basically offering extreme scenarios where the US could exercise leverage. So even if that leverage is not exercised, the fact that it exists means that you can influence negotiations in many other policy areas. And we have seen this perhaps most prominently in the recent trade agreement, where the Director General Trade of the European Commission, Sabine Weyand, has said publicly that this has influenced the trade outcome. And also European Council President Costa has hinted at that possibility. So I think there's a lot sort of to look into and a lot to worry about in that space. Okay, so what do we do in this paper? We do have sort of the global landscape of US foreign military sales, and what this table shows is where do the US export to? And what you see here, and we want to focus on Europe now, what you see here is that Europe has taken more space, greater importance in US foreign military sales than it used to be the case before the occupation of Crimea. And especially in the last couple of years, this has increased very substantially with the full-blown attack of Russia against Ukraine. This table is, by the way, in the database, also in the paper that we published. So no need to copy it from here. And if you look more specifically at Europe, what you see here is this very substantial increase starting 2017, but then it really, really increases quite dramatically after 2022. And in terms of the countries, Poland stands out in the last years, but also other countries take up significant space. Germany in 23 is significant. The Netherlands in 24. Greece is an important customer. And the 25 numbers only cover the first few months, and I think there will be significant adjustments once we have the full year in the database. The second thing that really stands out, that specific technologies, air defense systems, missiles, radar, software, that's where the dependency is there, and where also the reliance on the U.S. The defense industrial base is very significant at the moment. And so, is this a worry or not? Right? I mean, this is basically what we need to discuss, and I think there are basically four reasons why we need to think about this, and we need to reconsider to what extent we buy from the United States. I mean, the first is about industrial capacity. If you rely too much on imports, it's probably going to be quite difficult to build your own domestic production base. That is, an issue in particular when it comes to innovation capacity, the capacity to build weapons at scale when needed, and also the capacity to scale high-tech, very expensive high-tech products, right? I mean, you can only develop high-tech products if you are then able to sell them at significant scale. If you don't do that, the development costs will just be too high relative to the development cost will just be too high per delivered product. So you need scale for high-tech products. The second issue is technological dependence more specifically. So we are now relying on arguably some of the best technologies in the military warfare space in the world. I mean, the US is leading in many products. And that is, on the one hand, a strength. On the other hand, it also means that by continuing to buy, you reinforce that technological superiority. And there are products, components, and software that are critical for modern warfare that you just don't have direct control over, right? I mean, you depend on US suppliers to provide them to you. And I think what we know is that nowadays it's not just sort of a one-time delivery, it's all about continuous maintenance and updating of the systems. And that's particularly important when it comes to software systems. And I mean, just to give you sort of one example that I think a lot has been talked about, the F-35 dependence and this whole discussion on kill switches and this kind of stuff. What I would perhaps highlight instead of the F-35 is the recent decision by the German government to buy frigates from actually a German supplier, namely ThyssenKrupp Marine Systems. These are the F-127 frigates. So you would think this is not increasing our dependence on the US defense industrial base, but what is happening is that these frigates actually are equipped with air missile and air defense equipment, and there is a software system called Aegis, which is a US combat software system. And I mean, the problem with this is, I mean, it's great. It's integrated into NATO. It's integrated into existing systems that we use and that we should be using. But there is this, however big, risk that at some stage, especially when the relations get worse, this software might not be updated, or might be updated with delays, or might be not sort of equipped with the 100% capabilities, as also US President himself has hinted at for the F-35 or for the next generation of fighter jets, when he suggested in a public tweet, okay, he tweets a lot, when he suggested that perhaps allies should get equipment with lower capabilities, because at some stage they might not be allies anymore. So he said that on the record. So you have there, I would say, a dependence that can very quickly mean that major equipment such as ships, frigates, might basically not work anymore properly, because I mean, when you don't have the software on it that works properly, I mean, basically your ship turns into a bunch of steel swimming in the sea. It's not a full frigate anymore. Finally, so finally, there is a question of the supply chain dependence and the extent to which it's symmetric or asymmetric. And let me mention there the F-35 fighter jet. The F-35 fighter jet is, of course, not just a US product. I mean, it involves lots of equipment also from various European producers. But arguably, this is still an asymmetric supply chain dependence, where the US is central and the US producers are central in the supply chain, while the European ones can be relatively quickly replaced, as has also been seen, I think, in a previous episode when I think Turkey dropped out. So I think that was already exceeding my 5 minutes. Ethan, we look forward to your presentation.
Up? Is that okay? I'm a professor. I'm used to, walking around the classroom. So first, it's an incredible honor to be here. I have been a consumer of Bruegel product, ever since Bruegel was stood up by Fitoussi, right? Back in the day, my old friend. So it's just a real thrill to be at a place where I've used so much of the research over the years. I often get invited now to stuff because I bring a historical perspective. This is, what being 100 years old brings to you. Now I have a historical perspective on the issues. And Guntram mentioned this low point in alliance relations. I was not around for the Suez Crisis, it's true, but I certainly am aware of the Suez Crisis of 1956. I'm aware that de Gaulle pulled out of the integrated military command of NATO. I'm aware of a Euro missile crisis, of the crisis over Ostpolitik, the crisis over the Iraq War. There have been lots of alliance crises. And so what's new about this, I think, remains a question for debate. Guntram spoke a lot, so I'm an economist. I'm also from New York. So that interaction term, New York economist, it means like I'm not the most polite guest that probably Bruegel's ever had. I'm just going to kind of be in your face about stuff. I expect you to push back on me, but that's kind of how we're raised. My wife keeps criticizing how I interact with others, how I play with others with this being a New York economist, but she hasn't quite tamed me yet. Anyway, not Chicago, but Harvard pretty bad, pretty bad genes too in that sense. Anyway, you use the term dependence a lot, and that's a headline-grabbing term. But the argument I want to make to you is that the allies are joined at the hip. They are interdependent. I'm not going to talk about the $1.6 trillion of trade that goes across the Atlantic both ways. 1.6 trillion. I'm not going to talk about that. But as Guntram himself pointed out, 1/3 of American equipment sales go overseas. 26% of Lockheed Martin revenues are from overseas sales. Well, that gives the buyers a lot of leverage. If you are very dependent on foreign markets, that means the foreign market has a lot of leverage. And it's not by accident that F-35s are being assembled in Italy, in Germany, in Japan, in lots of countries around the world. That is the market power that the buyer got from the US supplier. So this really is a two-way street, and that's kind of what I want to focus on today. Just by the way, the Secretary of Defense or War, whatever we call him now, Pete Hegseth, said in a speech just the other day, we must support weapons sales to our allies. This is a top priority. So the US is very aware of the importance of this relationship, and I think is working very hard to maintain it. I should also remind you that this is a two-way street in the sense that the US buys lots of stuff from Europe. Where did the Joint Strike Missiles on the F-35 come from? Every single Joint Strike Missile on every single F-35 comes from where? Norway, Kongsberg, one supplier, one European supplier. Every single Joint Strike Missile. Every single naval strike missile that we are going to buy for a new class of ships is coming from one European supplier, Kongsberg. I can give you lots and lots of examples. The US now buying icebreakers from Finland. The US relying on South Korea for shipbuilding expertise. I can give you lots and lots of examples, and I think if we looked empirically at what's happening among the allies, we would see very tight and perhaps tightening bonds of interdependence. Okay, that's kind of the setup. Just really quickly, again, there's a lot of hand-wringing in Europe about the deterioration of the alliance relationship. It is true that the US strategic priority now is China. The US strategic priority is not Russia. The US strategic priority is China. Europe's strategic priority is Russia. That actually makes for a stronger relationship because there will be less free riding in the relationship. Some strategic divergence actually produces more heterogeneity, and that's where you get gains from trade. This quote from Olson and Zeckhauser, the famous article, The Economics of Alliances, I read it, reread it the other day, and I had this epiphany. This phrase, decline in the amity, unity, and community of interest among allies need not necessarily reduce the effectiveness of the alliance. Why? Because again, now Europe realizes it has to invest more in defense against Russia. That relieves a burden from the United States so it can focus more on China. And then they can invest more in what they do best. And so some strategic divergence of priorities is actually leading to greater alliance capability versus the free riding that went on throughout most of the Cold War, where Europe could get away with spending virtually nothing on defense. So we are in a new era. I would argue that it's making for a more balanced alliance relationship. Europe is outproducing the US in 155 shells. Sorry, it's not a very clear chart, but the green line just shows you that European production of 155 shells is taking off. The US cannot produce as many as it needs. This is fantastic for the United States. European rearmament is fantastic for the United States at a time when the US defense industrial base is completely strapped. So this is incredibly important strategically for the US. But the US produces the long-range missiles that Europe needs. It's nice to talk about the Aster, but there's a reason why Germans are going to build Patriots. There's just a lot more Patriots being built. You have a lot more economies of scale, and the Germans are, of course, taking advantage of that. So you have this emerging division of labor, okay? It's true that Europe is not going to catch up on all of US capabilities. The US spends 10 times more on defense R&D than Europe. And so the idea that Europe's going to replicate the United States, I think, is a pipe dream. But that doesn't mean that Europe will not find really important niches in this defense universe, which it has already found, as I mentioned the case of Kunzberg with missiles. Okay? So again, just to wrap up, transatlantic cooperation is going strong. You know, the one thing you really learn in economics is to try to separate the signal from the noise. It is true that our President Trump makes a lot of noise, but you want to try and look at the signal. Look at the data. Look at the empirics. And I would suggest to you that this shows that a balanced relationship is emerging, one that maybe is stronger than the alliance relationship we knew for many, many years. Thank you.
Thank you. Yes, okay. Thank you very much. And first, apologies for, on behalf of Anne, for her not being able to attend, and apologies that you have to satisfy yourself with myself. I will try to be concise, but I also try to react to some of the points that the previous speakers made. First, I think it is important to underline that what Guntram was saying is something that is perfectly shared by the European Commission, because what we see is clearly an increasing tendency to buy from third country companies, and in particular from the US. And just to come back a bit to the data that we were looking at, which is very similar to yours, we can see that the demand on the European market has tremendously increased in the last 10 years. It has been multiplied more or less by 3 times in real terms. The value of the notifications of FMS sales to EU member states to the US Congress between 2013 and 2015 and 2020 21 and 23 has been multiplied by 10, which, with all the caveats about the data and the fact that not all notified sales transform into real sales, etc., shows clearly that there is a very big discrepancy between the rhythm of the increase of the demand in the European Union and the rhythm of the part that this demand is addressed to the United States. Another data that I want to share with you, which is also very interesting, again, data in the defense field is always to be taken with a lot of carefulness, because it's always a lot of problems with the reliability of the data. But we, before even the war in Ukraine, we can see that this demand increase is very strong. But in the same time, we do not see an impact yet on intra-EU trade of defense-related products. And that is a very worrying sign, because that means that this demand that is increasing is not addressed cross-border within the European Union. It is either addressed to third countries or goes entirely domestically. And that is one of the main drawbacks that we have in Europe. It is our fragmented European market. And that puts us in a very difficult situation compared to the US. Because, of course, you can say that foreign clients have a lot of power. But when you look at the ratio of exports before the war, because that can be influenced by the war, the European defense industry exports outside of the EU 79% more than the intra-EU transfers, which shows that the dependence that we have on third markets is much higher than the dependence of the US. And the US can rely on a high integrated market, which means that the dependence is less acute. If you already buy 2,000 F-35s, that's already a very large scale on which you can achieve economies of scale. If we buy a few hundred and we depend on sending to third countries to keep the production line functioning, that is a much more difficult situation, both in terms of achieving economies of scale and in terms of keeping our production going. Now, what is important, I think, to say here is that, and here I will be on the same line as you, we are in a different world compared to what we were in a few years ago. You mentioned the production capacity of 155 millimeter shells. And indeed, one of the discovery was that the European Union has a higher production capacity than the US. But what is even more interesting is to discover that the joint US and EU production capacity in the beginning of the war was equivalent to only 6 days of firing of the Ukrainian armed forces, which shows that we need to invest on both sides of the Atlantic, and it is not enough to rely on one or the other. We need all to really take this effort seriously, and the only way we can increase our production capacity in a credible manner is to address demand to our industry, which will not invest in new capacities if there is no demand. In this respect, and I think that is also something that I think that, of course, there are discussions on the state of the relations between the US and the EU. But what is also very important is to be conscious that even if we have the best possible relationships, the US may not always be able to help us even if it wants. And that is linked to what you said. There is this pivot to Asia and to China in particular. And there has been a lot of studies in the US in the past years that shows that the US production capacity itself is not fit for large-scale war. And unfortunately, the US is much more transparent than us in terms of production capacity, and you can find information on the production possibility for all the major programs. And one study I want to quote finds that with the surge rate, which is like existing capabilities but used to their maximum, the US will take more than 8 years to replace its current arsenal, which shows that we have also a discussion here which has to take into account that we both have to invest. And it is not only about the relations between the US and the EU administrations, which is a separate problem. The US, if it is taken into a major conflict with China, will not be able to help us. And we have to have the possibilities to cater for that and to be able to satisfy our own needs in respect to the needs of high-intensity conflict. And in this, in conclusion, I want to come back to what the Commission has been doing in this respect, because for us this is not new. I was part of the team that developed the European Defence Industrial Development Programme, which is one of the precursors of the European Defence Fund. And already in the development of this instrument, we had the clear objective that we need to build a capacity and technologies in Europe that can be used in a manner that is independent. Not necessarily because we don't trust the US, but because we need to be able to operate on our own if that is needed. And that is, I don't want to enter in all the details, but that has been the main guiding line in all the Commission initiatives that have followed. The European Defence Fund, the EDIRPA, which was for incentivizing member states to buy together, the ASAP, which was an instrument to support industrial production capacity increase, the European Defence Investment Programme, which has been adopted and which will come into force, which also, all of these programs come with the conditions that the demand, the projects should be directed to the European defense industry. And they should ensure also that what is developed in terms of technology, as Guntram has mentioned, is something that we can use independently. And in addition, in what we have now in the European Defense Industry Program, we also have the clear objective to map the capacities and the supply chains in order to establish where are the bottlenecks, where are the dependencies, and where are the critical faults that we have to address. This was done in the 155, and we managed with a very small budget to address exactly the parts of the supply chain which had the bottlenecks that are necessary, and with the EDIP we hope to be able to bring this to another level. But I think it is also critical to understand and to have a change of mindset, because we are so used for the past 3 decades to think that we have an industry which is in overcapacity, because that was the conception that prevailed before the war, that we can continue with fragmented markets. This is not possible. I'm an economist. It's very difficult to be economist in the defense field. People always look at you strangely, but the having such a fragmented market is not only economic inefficiency, it's a strategic liability. It prevents us from building the scale and the economies of scale that are necessary to achieve the type of capacity and independence that Guntram was calling for. And that's why we need to act in this respect.
Wonderful. Wonderful. Thank you. Thank you. These were also great. Great comments. So I mean, we don't have that much time, because I do want to bring the audience, but perhaps we have one quick round here among ourselves. And I mean, I just wanted to sort of perhaps add two or three quick thoughts, and then Ethan, you can react, and then we perhaps open up. I mean, I think the first point is, you know, I really want to believe you. You know, I think, and I think most Europeans that have grown up in my generation are very transatlantic in orientation, right? And we've always been very transatlantic in orientation. And I really hope you're right on the signal versus noise, right? I mean, I really hope you're right. Am I 100% sure? I have to say I have my sincere doubts, given how profound the changes are that are happening in the United States at the moment. And I think they're much more profound than we are actually ready to admit when it comes to domestic politics, to the justice system, to the assault on universities. There's so many dimensions where things are really changing quite dramatically that I'm much less confident than perhaps you are. You have been in your remarks as regards the trajectory, right? And so I think when you start from that, I guess very quickly you you want to look at, okay, where are the strengths, and yes, let's build on the strengths, but where are also the risks, the extreme risks? And I think as a security person, I mean, and I'm an economist, but I think for what I'm sort of as an economist trained at is sort of game theory also, right? And when you have extreme scenarios, you know that they influence basically the middle, the center ground and the equilibrium. So extreme outcomes in games influence baseline outcomes. And that's why I think basically we need to tell the traditionally extremely transatlantic security community, also as economists, that they need to think about extreme scenarios much more carefully. And I do think that these extreme scenarios include scenarios where the reliance on the U.S. defense industrial base it becomes a liability. So I think that's the first point. The second, and perhaps that's where I want to push you a little bit, is to talk a little bit more about the parallel movement that we are seeing beyond the sort of tech superiority. We are also of the United States in some areas. We are also seeing a revolutionization of the way wars are fought, right? And to be honest, I'm not sure when we talk of modern drone warfare, when we talk even of the latest generation of missiles, supersonic missiles, this kind of stuff, that the US automatically has that advantage already now. And so, yes, I think in that space, there is a question, if we direct our demand to those European suppliers, the startups that are emerging around Munich. In France, we have some significant startups. We have, of course, the Ukrainian defense industrial base, which is very important. So if we are able to direct some of that demand instead of just automatically, instinctively going for the US suppliers that might actually not even have yet the kind of products that are needed, instead direct them at the European ones, we have a chance of actually building our own technological stack that might turn into a strength, and that might be a strength also in the transatlantic relation ultimately. So perhaps you can talk a little bit about sort of the tech side of it and the modernization. I would find that fascinating.
Yeah, I'll try to be quick because I want to hear the audience responses. First, so I didn't speak about U.S. domestic politics. I actually think that's a different issue. In economics, when you study industrial organization, what you learn is that it's the structure of the market that matters. So let's say I have a brilliant idea, but I'm entering a competitive market. That competition is going to force my prices down, no matter if I like it or not. It's the structure of the system that shapes those interactions with other firms. So again, it's structure. I'm not talking about the firm itself and who the leader of the firm is and if they're a good CO or a bad CO or what their product. It's the structure and how that's going to press down on the firm. So what I'm trying to give you is a sense of what the structure of the international system is and how that's playing out, okay? So again, I think for a lot of these discussions, what's happening within the US, as troubling as that may be to Europeans, just as some American officials like to comment on European domestic politics, to me that's more noise than signal in terms of strategy. In terms of game theory, what I learned in game theory was it's heterogeneity in interest that creates gains from trade. And that's what I'm suggesting, is that now some heterogeneity between the US and Europe is actually producing greater gains from trade, which in fact leads to my third point. First, I should say my wife is French. I have 3 daughters and 2 granddaughters in Paris, and no one's more invested in European security in this room than I am. I can tell you that right now. There's no one in this room more invested in European security than me. So I've got skin in the game. And so, it is possible that a lot of US defense R&D is going to legacy kinds of systems and that maybe there's a possibility. I'm all for Europe looking for its niches. Do I think Europe can replicate the US in a lot of these technologies? No, I just don't think that's realistic. And so to me, a realistic strategy like the one adopted by Kongsberg in Norway, and I can give you lots of other firms in Europe, is to find niches where they are going to have superior technologies, which then the US is going to acquire, and I think we see that. And so I would say, look at what firms are doing. There is just a ton of transatlantic cooperation among firms. And so this suggests to me, again, the robustness of the relationship, the belief that we do have to work together to solve these strategic problems, that different sides of the table are bringing different capacities together. And so to me, that's the future.
I will not comment on the internal US policy, of course, and on the noise versus substance in that. What I want to come back again is, and you spoke of structure, and that is the structure of the European defense market. And that is something we really need to address. And unfortunately, there is a link between this and the recourse to third country suppliers. Because we have a fragmented market where nobody is big enough to achieve the necessary scale. That's the big question, and that's what we are trying to do with our instruments. And one of the things that they said is, the only way to increase industrial capacity in Europe is to address demand to the European companies. And when the big part of the demand goes outside, that is, by definition, creates a vicious circle. So you have European production capacity is limited, therefore I'm going to buy from the Americans, and therefore the European production capacity will remain limited because, of course, it only can increase if there are contracts. And I think it's extremely important to understand, and here I'll come to my economics again, sorry for that. The defense sector is also a sector that is characterized by long-term structural cost escalation trend, which means that the purchasing power of budgets decreases with time. And that has an asymmetric effect on small ones and on big ones. It is not the same effect if you are small, where you have to abandon some capabilities, when you are big and you can just reduce numbers. And in fact, we have the potential of being big. If you look at the defense investment spending in the EU, that will be the second or third largest domestic market in the world, of a size comparable to the Chinese and, of course, behind the US. But we need to tap into that capacity and in that potential for scale and for innovation. Because a company that goes to the US market, a startup, and manages to pierce in the US market, immediately can serve a huge market. In Europe, you have to go to 27 different procuring entities, win contracts in different countries, manage to obtain transfer authorizations, etc. And that is what we are trying to do. And just to finish, for the coming months, we'll have a very intense discussion also in the framework of the revision of the Defense Procurement Directive on how we can ensure that the demand also goes to the European defense industrial and technological base. And it will be very important to convince the member states in particular of the need to address this demand to the European industry.
Thank you so much. Thank you so much, Georgi. And indeed, your last point on the lack of integration of the European market is very dear also to my heart and to our heart. I mean, we published, as you might remember, a piece on the European defense, what we call the European defense mechanism, which was all about how do we integrate the European market for defense products so as to achieve the necessary scale and for the companies. Because at the moment we have a lot of high-tech companies that are emerging, but then they are serving very small markets and cannot basically get the scale that is necessary. So this is a very important topic also. So we want to take some questions, and I see already 3 questions in the room. The gentleman here in the front, the gentleman there in the back, and oh my God, there's 5, 6 questions, and I have 3 online already. So let's take in batches of 3, and please short questions, and please also introduce yourself very quickly.
Hi, Oliver Grimm. I'm with the Austrian newspaper Die Presse and also write for the newsletter La Matinale Européenne. My question to the 3 of you, in light of what I've heard here, is it still a good use of taxpayers' money in Europe to keep trying to build a joint fighter jet or a joint ground combat system, a Euro tank. Is that a good idea, since we're never going to catch up with whatever the F-35 or the Abrams or something? Or do you think it's important because we need to do that?
Thank you. So let's take always three. So the second was there. Yeah, exactly.
Hello, thank you. I'm a master's student of international politics in Ghent, and I study a lot on political communication, and especially populist discourse. And in that regard, something that interests me quite a lot is, in the second Trump administration, quite a consistent pattern of supporting the rhetoric of our own European far-right populist parties, and frequent, for example, media appearances with Elon Musk interviewing Alice Weidel from AfD, which is curious because a lot of these parties are fundamentally anti-European integration. And so my question there is this noise or is this signal? Is this a US foreign policy to support these parties instead of our classic European centrist parties?
Okay, thank you. Not directly on the defense topic, but okay, then here.
Hi, Friedrich Lucke from the European Commission. I have a question for Mr. Kapstein. I buy your argument that when you look at the data, there's a strong integration of the defense sectors transatlantically. And I see that when you build it in a scenario where the US is just trying to get Europe to bear more of the burden of combating Russia, that this would be a sign of strength. But in the realistic reading of foreign policy, a lot of people were saying, actually what the US is trying to do with Russia is pull them away from the Chinese camp, potentially into its own, in order to build a large coalition against China, which from the European perspective would be very misguided, and it would basically enable Russia, a declining superpower, to punch above its weight by playing Europe and the US off against one another. And that would be more so the stronger the European and American defense sector are interconnected. So do you think that your idea that this this interconnection between the different defense sectors is a sign of strength carries through to this kind of scenario?
Okay, so these are three. You wanna? They were mostly addressed to you.
I'm not going to address the
with the mic.
Oh, yeah. Sorry. I don't think I'll address the good use of European taxpayer money, because there are a lot of European taxpayers here. You know, what I always feel, and I say the same thing about defense spending in Washington, these decisions should be as transparent as possible. These decisions, you know, the government should be forthcoming. Here are the costs, here are the alternatives, is this the best alternative? And then let the taxpayers decide. That's what happens in a democracy. And so I'm not going to tell European taxpayers whether they should build a 6th-generation fighter or invest in AI or whatever else. But I think we should look at what those alternatives are, and then hopefully those get embedded in electoral platforms, and people vote on those kinds of decisions. I'm not really going to touch the populace. And, you know, I'm an economist.
On the third question,
Yeah.
perhaps, yeah.
And, you know, again, I'm just a humble economist. I'm not really like a grand strategist or something. So, you know, like to speak to the, you know, this chessboard of the international system. It's not really, and I'm very skeptical of these grand theories anyway, I have to say, of the world. But, you know, I guess, again, my view is this. If the US strategic priority is China, then the US wants to focus on that. And if Russia becomes less of a threat and Europe kind of can deal with that, I think that's good for the United States. That's how I kind of think about it, that Europe really wants to focus. And let me just say one word, that remember, to your point, if Europe is building, let's say, 155 capacity, capacity to build 155 shells, those are out of reach of Chinese missiles. You know, it's nice that the South Koreans, it's nice that the Japanese, nice that, you know, people in Asia are doing this stuff. They're going to be taken out in the first hour. So the US is going to be looking for strategic reserves. And those are in Europe. So again, I don't think Europeans appreciate how critical a strategic partner they are right now. Thank you.
Did you want to say something?
Yes, I'll just say a few words mainly on the question of the joint. And I think in my answer, what really matters is the joint. I am not a technical specialist, so about whether we should build that capacity or that capacity. But what we have to do in Europe is to build jointly. Because what we cannot afford anymore to do is to do 5 tanks, spend 5 times for developing tanks, having ridiculously small, almost artisanal production. I mean, I'm sorry, I'm a bit blunt on this. And then hope that we will be able to keep that production running afterwards. We need, in the current situation of the geopolitical world, we need to be able to achieve mass, and we need to tap into our defense single market potential to achieve that. So we really need to do it jointly in order to achieve that. And that's also where I was saying there is a link with the US, because the more member states go to buy to the US, the more that reduces the demand that is going to be addressed for some capacities in Europe and the capacity to build the European industrial capacity in these fields. So there is a link between these two topics, and that's why we need to really, and all the actions of the European Commission since the beginning has been directed at incentivizing member states to do things together. We fund R&D only if it is cooperative. We fund procurement only if it is common. And that is the mainstay of our policies, and that is extremely important, because also if you spend 5 times on tanks, that means that you will not be able to do something else, because money is finite.
Yeah. So just to say, I mean, I totally agree on the artisanal production point. I mean, it's still absurd up to now, the quantities that we are producing, in particular if you compare it with the Russian sort of assembly lines, where literally they are churning out these kind of products at a factor of 10, 20 times or 50 times what Europeans do collectively. So this is, I think, one point. I think the second point I want to emphasize is when it comes to the transparency of what works and what doesn't work. I mean, what I find quite striking is that existing procurement agencies, as we have them, they have, of course, a bias towards established existing systems and established existing producers. And I'm quite worried about that, because as we see, technology is advancing very quickly in that space, and there's a lot of new stuff coming. And our procurement agencies have a tendency to go for the old stuff, or to develop very expensive joint systems, which then raises the question: has there been an objective assessment on the effectiveness of these kind of systems compared to the way we see wars are being fought in Ukraine at the moment, right? I mean, and that's, I think, it is a very important and relevant benchmark. And so that, to me, leads at least to some question marks, and the question marks go in the direction that you are raising. So at least I would like to see a more specific impact assessment of the effectiveness of that kind of system. Let's take a few more questions, and so I have 3 questions there in the room, and possibly a 4th one. And we have online questions, which I will raise in addition. Please, let's start with the 3 here on the left side. We did the right side before. Please.
Hello. Yes, good. Hi, my name's Sam Wilkin. I'm the founder of a very new defense-focused publication called The Sentinel. Thank you all for the comments. I'd like to ask about the FCAS fighter program. There's been a lot of squabbling recently. If that program were to fail, what would that mean for dependency? And does the European Commission have any influence, and is it trying to mend relations between those partners? Thank you.
Thank you. The next one, there were 2 more on the left side. Yeah.
Can you hear me? Okay.
Yes.
I'm Leon Hojszowski from Finabel. I had a question for Mr. Yanakiev. In regards with what you mentioned about the fragmentation of the defense market in Europe, I wanted to ask if the Commission has a particular, how it is approaching the tension between consolidation and competition, and if the Commission is viewing the creation of European giants, so to say, favorably, like Rheinmetall and BDA, or is this, and if so, how does the Commission want to approach like the market for startups in such a defense industrial field?
Thank you. So the third one there in the back, and then I'm trying to get you as well. Yeah.
Good afternoon. My name is Armin Ladany. I'm representing Hypex Consulting, representing Hungarian defense companies. And I have a very simple question. What impact do you expect from the safe regulation, from the security action for Europe to have on the European purchases of US military equipment? Thank you.
Thank you. And the fourth one here, and then I will read at least two from the online.
Thank you. Nan Tian from the Stockholm International Peace Research Institute. My question is, as the EU continues to rely on U.S. defense industry, how does this open up to vulnerabilities with the increasing tit-for-tat between with the Chinese export control on critical minerals to the EU?
I think on the critical raw materials and the tit-for-tat between China and the U.S. What's the impact on the defense industry, if I understood correctly? Yes. And so let me just read two from the online audience. And I'm sorry that I cannot get all five of you. I mean, one is by a guy anonymous. If the U.S. has not enough in defense industrial capacity, why does it want the EU to buy more of their weapons? I think that's sort of one very much on our trajectory for you. Ethan, and which one is the second one I wanted to take? So why not take the last one for Georgi? You highlighted Europe's potential in defense innovation and scale, given fiscal constraints and lack of consensus on Russian assets. How does the Commission plan to sustainably finance these ambitions? I think the financing aspect is also very interesting. Okay, so this gives a rich menu, I would say, of questions. I'm sorry I couldn't take all of them. Perhaps I take one last online, which is the one on Japan. I mean, can you characterize the transatlantic relation and put it into relation with how the security partnership with Japan is actually working? Because that I think is also in US-Japan, the security partnership is working. So Ethan, perhaps you start. Take the microphone because we have an online audience.
Yeah, I'll be quick because I think a lot of the questions were for our colleague here. Just really quickly on I didn't quite understand the question on critical minerals. Was it, is that harming the U.S. defense industry, Chinese policy toward? So, it's very hard to follow the state of play on this. It seems like that problem's been resolved for now. I think we should remind people, although the U.S. Considers China a strategic competitor now, and it is the peer competitor it worries about most, again, joined at the hip economically. And so I think it is interesting that a lot of these problems between the U.S. and China do end up being managed because they are so interdependent. And I don't think either side really seems to be willing to completely de-link from one another. I think there is this, and this was an EU term, de-risking versus de-linking, and I think it's interesting that the U.S. adopted that term, realizing de-linking was not a realistic strategy. De-risking was a much more thoughtful way to go about that. At the same time, the U.S. is trying to de-risk the critical minerals chain. You might have seen the Pentagon invested $1.4 billion last week in a couple of American firms. It is Canada's developing its capacity. So, there are ongoing efforts to try and de-link that. But, again, I think China has to be careful. It has used, people forget this, it's used export controls on critical minerals going back to in the 1990s. This is not a new thing. Again, our President Harry Truman had a great phrase that every young person in this room should memorize. The only thing new is the history you never learned. The only thing new is the history you never learned. So, as I say, in rare earths, China's gone back and forth on export controls for about 30 years. And I think it has found, if you try and exercise monopoly power, people will have high-powered incentive to seek alternatives, right? And at one point they did that, they drove the prices through the roof, people went out and found alternatives. So I have to say that's not an issue that keeps me up at night. The relationship with Japan, I think, is very interesting. Again, Japan is assembling F-35s. There are lots of cooperative arrangements ongoing with Japan. Interestingly, the defense industrial cooperation with the US and Japan has been more fraught over the years. If you think of the FSX program, this was a fighter jet that the US and Japan back in the 80s, I guess, were going to try and build cooperatively. Japan had some really cutting edge technology at that time that it didn't want to cede to the US. This created a lot of acrimony in US-Japan relations. So as I say, there is close cooperation, but that has been more fraught. And it is interesting that Japan is assembling the F-35, but they are not a co-development partner, unlike, say, the UK or some other countries. They decided not to play that role on F-35. So, again, that's a very interesting relationship, but it does seem, again, it's been strengthening more recently. I think you have a lot of EU questions.
Okay, thank you. I'm not sure I'll have time to answer everything in sufficient detail, so I'll try to focus on some aspects. On the FCAS, of course, that is something that is really a pity to see that there is such difficulties to agree on a common project. But here, at least, it is not something that we are funding, so there was a direct question to the Commission. But there are many other projects, including, for instance, the Eurodrone, which are funded by the European instruments and which are going forward. And as I mentioned, the European instruments only fund when there is cooperation. We are not supporting just national projects. We are supporting projects when companies from different member states come together to work together. And I think that the European Defence Fund has made a tremendous impact in incentivizing cooperation and in pushing cooperation to work faster, because in our instruments you don't need unanimity. You have a train that passes every year with the work program and the calls that are published, and if you don't catch this train, it is too late. That pushes member states to agree much faster sometimes on going forward for some type of cooperation. I think has been really a game changer in pushing cooperative projects compared to just intergovernmental cooperation before. The other question, and that's a very important question about the competition and integration. Just small disclaimer, I'm speaking, what I'm saying is not an official position of the European Commission, so you can only blame me if I say something wrong. But my view on this is that it has to be very clear that the priority is to integrate the demand side. This is a market where the demand side is leading, and the demand side has to be integrated. We are not trying to create giants on the supply side, and there is no, it can happen, but that can be the consequence of the market's response to integration in the demand side. But the Commission approach is not to consolidate the supply, it's not to create giants, it's to integrate the market, because the market is what is gonna allow companies to survive. And the market, as it was mentioned before, it's important for the big ones, but it's extremely important for the small ones, because a small, innovative company needs to have a big market on which to grow. And the current fragmentation of the market basically pushes a lot of innovative companies to the US. And we will also be publishing soon a defense transformation roadmap, which is the next initiative that is in the pipeline, which will specifically address the question of the startups, small actors, etc. But it has to be clear, the Commission is not trying to build giants on the supply side. We are trying to build a market on which companies can survive, and a real integrated market may even allow for multiple actors to survive, while small, narrow national markets may lead to the disappearance of these actors because they cannot sustain their economic survival on small markets.
Yeah, thank you so much. This was also a very important point at the end. I mean, we want actually multiple suppliers in an integrated market so as to have competition in the first place. So, and I think that's also characteristic of the US market, that you have big players, but you have competition. So anyway, thank you so much for your great questions, your interest. I can see this is a hot topic. A lot of people are really interested in it. So thank you so much, Ethan, for coming here from Princeton University, and Georgi, thank you so much for your view from the Commission, which was a really great replacement of Anfor. Thank you so much.